The fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard. Enough for that. Look, you could see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors padlocked, heavy on the sides of the spire. There was ivy, a small tree growing out of the guttering at the roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of rabbit or vole or weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen these things in the moonlight if you had been there at night. You might not have seen the pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates. And if you had seen her, with a second, more careful glance, you would have realized that she was only moonlight, mist, and shadow. The plump, pale woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through a clutch of half-fallen tombstones toward the front gates. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 in the afternoon in the winter and at 8 at night in the summer. Spike-topped iron railings ran around part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest of it. The bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old child. "Owens!" called the pale woman in a voice that must have been a rustle in the wind or through the long grass. "Owens, come look at this." She crouched down and peered at something on the ground as a patch of shadow moved into the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife and then looked at what she was looking at and scratched his head. "Mistress Owens," he said, for he came from a more formal age than our own. "Is that what I think it is?" At that moment, the thing he was inspecting seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth, letting the rubber nipple it was sucking on fall to the ground, and it reached out a small, chubby little fist, as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Miss Owens' pale finger. "Strike me silly," said Mr. Owens, "if that isn't a baby." "Of course it's a baby," said his wife. "And the question is, what is to be done with it?" "I dare say that is a question, Mistress Owens," said her husband, "and yet it is not our question. For there, a baby is unquestionably alive, and such has nothing to do with us, and it is no part of our world." "Look at him smile," said Mrs. Owens. "He has the sweetest of smiles." And with one insubstantial hand, she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place, for the graveyard covered the whole top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling. Someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the old gates and the heavy padlock and chain that held them. "There now," said Owens. "It's the babe's family. Come bring him back to the loving bosom. Leave the little man be," he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arm around the toddler, smoothing and stroking. Mrs. Owens said, "He don't look like nobody's family." That one, the man in the dark coat, had given up on rattling the main gates and was now examining the smaller side gate. It too was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. "Come on, Mistress Owens, leave it be, there's a dear," said Mr. Owens. When he saw a ghost and his mouth dropped open, he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did, you would be right, that Mr. Owens should not have taken on so at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead and had been for hundreds of years. And given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also dead, but there was a difference between folk of the graveyard and this, a raw, flickering, startling shape, the gray color of television static, all panic and naked emotion which flooded the Owenses as if it their own, as if it was their own. 3 figures, 2 large, 1 smaller, and only one of them was in focus, was more than an outline or a shimmer, and the figure said, "My baby! He's trying to harm my baby!" A clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy metal garbage can across the alley to the high brick wall that ran around the part of the graveyard. "Protect my son," said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman, of course the babe's mother. "What did he do to you?" asked Miss Owens, as she was not certain the ghost could hear her. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake in due time in the place you are buried, to come to terms with your death, and to get acquainted with the other inhabitants. This creature was nothing but alarm and fear for her child, and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting attention, for other pale figures were coming from all over the graveyard. I'm going to stop there.